Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming along. Having watched that little recap of 2003, which is where these files are meant to take us up to, you might be expecting me to talk lots about 2003, and if so, you're probably going to be quite disappointed because in 20 years of these files that I have gone through, I think this is unquestionably the worst year of files in terms of interesting things in there. Lots of incredibly bland stuff. Now, don't all leave at once. I'm coming to a but. There's really shockingly boring stuff in there. However, I'm not going to talk about that today. The big picture, I think, here is actually quite interesting because as we get closer to the present day, we're getting less and less of interest in these files. It's really striking, and we actually get a very clear example of that in the files that have been released here, because while these files are no more recent than 2003, that's when the file terminates. So some of these files might have run for several years, they might have only run for a few weeks, that doesn't really matter. It has to finish in 2003, but also you always get some files that for whatever reason, and sometimes it's a very boring thing such as somebody's moving office and they realize that there's a big pile of files in a store somewhere that were never sent to PRONI. There are these much older files that turn up, and this year we've got some of those as well. And so this year you can contrast very clearly between what was happening in the 1950s and the 1960s and in the 1990s and what's happening in 2003, and it's really stark. I'm speculating in this next bit that I'm going to say, but I think that there are probably two reasons for that. I think one of them is what Jane was talking about, freedom of information. That's not yet operative at this point, but the law has been passed in the year 2000. So there's a period of bedding in, of preparing for what's coming. And at this point, ministers and officials know that at some point in the future, journalists, academics, members of the public, anybody can write to a department and say, I want to see whatever it might be. Now, they might not get it, but at this point, they're not really clear about how it's going to work. And they know that it's going to mean more openness. And so that's going to change behavior. I think the second thing, and it might even be that this is more significant, I don't know, is the growing digitization of how government does work. And if you're wanting to hide something within government, which sometimes happens, obviously a digital record potentially is easier to get rid of, especially back then when maybe some of the modern forensic techniques were not as well known. But even setting aside that, I think the more common, the more prosaic, if you're thinking about all that government does, most of what government does is not that massively controversial or exciting or interesting to most people. It might be significant to me, might be significant to you for a particular reason, but actually, and especially at the time, it might not seem remotely interesting at all. I think what has happened in lots of these cases is that if somebody simply did not print something off, it was lost. Now, I'm sure there's people here who used to use floppy disks, CDs, all sorts of bits of technology that are now basically completely obsolete. And if you didn't get something off that in time, it's gone. We're in a slightly different place now with the cloud and saving stuff to a drive somewhere out in America or Ireland or wherever it might be, and having the sense that we can always access it. In this period, it's slightly different. And so I think those two things combine. I might be wrong about those reasons, but what's not in any way in dispute here is that these files are very different to the files that went before. However, as I said, don't all leave, because there is, even in a bad year, lots of interesting stuff. Some of the interesting things from more modern files here, I'll run through very quickly. There's some detail about what was happening at Kilroot Power Station just down Belfast Lock from where we are here. It was burning coal at that point. That finished last year, so it's not doing that any longer, but it was right up until that point burning coal. And it was releasing almost 500,000 kilograms of particulates a year at the start of this century, in the early 2000s. It was also putting out 2.8 million tons of carbon dioxide, 33 tons of volatile organic compounds, 75 kilograms of mercury, and there's more, 139 kilograms of lead, 24 kilograms of arsenic, a whole host of other things. It was a very dirty piece of equipment. There were several points where the file records that it had breached what were seemingly quite generous stormont stances in terms of what it was allowed to release into Belfast Lock. But even allowing for what it was in theory allowed to release, it was very, very significant. A very separate modern file shows that Sinn Féin MLA Alex Maskey was supportive of public funding for an Islamic religious school in Belfast in his now, I was going to say his now South Belfast constituency. He's now retired, of course. What was his future South Belfast constituency, and he wanted Islam to be included on the school curriculum. In that same file, which is a Stormont Department of Education file, there's reference to DUP MLAs writing to the department. At this point, Martin McGuinness is the Education Minister. That's obviously very controversial for the DUP, so they don't write to Martin McGuinness. They write to his permanent secretary, and they get a letter back from Martin McGuinness. There's this sort of quite elaborate dance, but they write to the department and they express abhorrence at sex education booklets, which they say are being given to children, and they set out activities which are too foul to describe what Jim Wells said in one letter. Ultimately, he writes back to them and says, "You've misunderstood this. This is included in a Stormont in a Stormont brochure which is going to teachers, but it specifies that not all of these will be suitable for children, and they're to look at them themselves, etc." A separate recent file sets out a secret system of vetting for civil servants. This was based on undisclosed intelligence. It was an operation as recently as 2003. And what really worried civil servants at this point is that it almost tumbled into public view. So we can see it now. They were worried back then that we might see it then. And what it essentially meant was that if you applied for a job in the civil service, there was the typical things that you would get in any job. You sat an interview, you had to put in your CV, you did all of that. But even if you were selected for the job, there was then the potential that there would be other intelligence that would be looked at, and somebody would say, no, this is not a suitable person for employment. Now, that happens to this day in certain very sensitive jobs within the public sector, and that's right and proper. You don't want somebody being in charge of nuclear weapons if there's something that really means they shouldn't be doing that. But what the problem was here from the government's perspective was that they were applying this to basically everybody, it seems. And people at incredibly junior ranks who really had no particular significance were being knocked back. Some of those people challenged that in a tribunal, and the government was really worried because they thought, to defend this, we're going to have to admit what we've been doing. They happily, from their perspective, managed to basically buy these people off. They made an offer to them, they accepted it. Part of the deal was that they would have a review of this, they would talk to the Human Rights Commission, etc. But they were absolutely jubilant that they had managed to do this for quite a small sum of money, a few tens of thousands of pounds. Those are the modern files. I'll come back to some other modern files which are a bit more interesting, but let me take it back to the 1950s. And this is the really interesting stuff from my perspective. There is one file in particular which talks about this radical plan to dam Strangford Lough. Now, I love the Ards Peninsula. It's one of my favourite parts of Northern Ireland. It's a very picturesque place. It's a sleepy place. It's got lovely beaches. It's got Mount Stewart. But it would have looked very, very differently by the time I was born if this had happened. And effectively what happened was there was a quite long-standing complaint from people on the Ards Peninsula that they were cut off from the rest of County Down. They had to go the whole way around the peninsula to get to the rest of County Down. And so if you live in Portaferry, that's an entirely understandable complaint. They're saying, why can we not have a bridge? Why can we not have something that gets us from here to Strangford in a much more efficient manner? But the problem was that when the county surveyor looked at this, he decided it was going to cost what today would be the equivalent of £20 million. And he thought that was nowhere near justifiable in terms of the numbers of people who would be using this. But he didn't drop the idea. He thought, let's see if there's something else we could do here. So he put his mind to it and he came up with this idea of what he called a barrage or a barrage. I'm not sure exactly how I should say that. It's not an artillery barrage. It's about basically filling in most of the mouth of the lough so that you could drive across it. Now, there were going to be lock gates so that a bit like a canal, you could get small craft in and out of the lough. It's not entirely clear to me how that was going to work. But the more radical element of this was that he was going to then lower the lough by half. So this was going to create 5,000 acres of land, agricultural land mostly, but also he wanted to build an airport near, a major airport, not what there is in Ards right now, a major international airport that would take over basically from Aldergrove. He thought it would be more convenient to Belfast. It was flat land. There were lots of things that he thought were going for this. And it didn't stop there. He wanted to turn what remained of Strangford Lough from a seawater lough into a freshwater lough. This he thought would then attract industry. He thought they could build a huge factory in the Ards Peninsula. He thought that even in itself wasn't enough. He thought they could build a nuclear power station on the Ards Peninsula. And the plan in some ways was quite simple. A nuclear power station needs lots of water to cool the great heat which it manages to produce. And he thought that it could suck in from one side of the peninsula fresh water from the loch, and on the other side put out the polluted water into the sea, where he thought the sea would basically take it away. It would be dispersed, and that would be fine. This obviously did not happen. One of the reasons why it didn't happen is that it was public at the time, so we see much more of what went on inside government in this file. But there was lots of commentary about this in the newspapers at the time, in the Newton Ards Chronicle in particular, in the Belfast Telegraph, there was a lot of coverage. And what we see in this file, quite interestingly, is that Brian Faulkner, who was a local representative for the Unionist Party, he was very influential. He was not, obviously, at this point, the person that he became as PM of the old Northern Ireland government, but he was expressing privately to Lord Glentoran, the Commerce Minister, that he was completely opposed to this. He said, I'm not going to say this publicly. He maybe thought it wouldn't be very popular at that point, and people wanted this idea of connection between the two places. Lord Glentoran basically indicated that he was of a similar mind, but he wasn't going to say anything either at that point. But then there's this campaign of letters in the newspapers, and particularly from farmers in the Ards Peninsula, where they draw attention to all of the unintended consequences of this, or rather some of them. And mainly what they're worried about is the climate. They say Cumber early potatoes can only be grown and be the first in Northern Ireland because of the temperate climate. There are something like 700 million tons, I think it was, of seawater that come in and out of the loch every day. That means that at Mount Stewart they can grow semi-tropical plants in ways that you couldn't in other parts of Northern Ireland. It's a very unique microclimate. And once you start tampering with this, our whole livelihood is not going to be what it was and what we thought it would be. There's also questions as to whether the reclaimed land, which would be very saline, having been underwater for whatever, thousands of years, whatever it is, was suddenly going to be growing potatoes or other crops. They didn't think that was feasible without very expensive work to try to remove the salt. And there were a host of reasons. The clincher for this was that they realized that there wasn't enough fresh water flowing into the loch to ever turn it into a freshwater lake. And more than that, the towns and villages around the loch would be flushing in very unpleasant substances that come out of people's toilets. And it would ultimately potentially mean that there would be so much sewage in the loch that it would be a giant cesspit. And so the idea that this had been seen as a form of bringing in more tourists, getting rid of the mud flats, all of this sort of stuff, very quickly it became clear that really wasn't going to happen. And the reason that I think this file is so interesting is that it really speaks to both the vast ambition of that age, but also to an extent what we now see as some of the ignorance of that age. This was after the Second World War. This was a period where people were harnessing nuclear power as what they thought would be a cheap form of power. They were building vast structures around the world. There was a sense of progress, a sense of optimism. Here, there was a sense that there were warmer relations north-south than there had been. There were all sorts of reasons why people thought they could do things that hitherto had never been possible. And in many ways, that is true in so many things in so many of what that generation managed to do. But there was also the sense here that they could just do anything. This was the period where Terence O'Neill was thinking about draining Lough Neagh and turning it into a 7th county of Northern Ireland, with a great aspiration behind it. The idea that you could start from scratch. It could be a mixed community. It wouldn't be Protestant or Catholic. It would be freed of some of the shackles of the past. All of that. Lots of sort of quite interesting ideas. But actually, we now realise how significant it is when you start tampering with nature. And so when they looked at this, they started to wonder, could you even fill in the mouth of the loch? This is incredibly rapidly moving water. It's going to cost an awful lot more than we thought. And ultimately, it's going to move fish supplies. It's going to tamper with so many elements, even of what they could think about. And so ultimately, as we know, it didn't happen. There was, of course, a ferry service put in place. That was something that at the outset the surveyor had poo-pooed. He didn't think that was really up to much. That's what happened. The council paid for it. Now Stormont pays for it. It still runs to this day. And so you can get between those two places quicker, but you can't walk across on dry land. Two other things from the old files. A very interesting thing from a similar era, just before the Troubles break out. There is a file where the RUC look at their vehicle fleet. This is a classic piece of bureaucratic accountancy, basically. They're looking at what do they have. So how many saloon cars, how many traffic cars, how many water cannon, what do we have, and do we need them, and do we need to update them, etc., etc. And so it's all fed back into the Stormont machine. And this is before the Troubles. This is before there's the what we all know was to come. And the really striking thing about this to me is that when you look at this, they have no sense of what's to come at all whatsoever. It's not like there's sort of covert planning for something that they think might come. They're going in the opposite direction. They're getting rid of some of the armoured vehicles that they have. They think they don't really need them. And so in this file from the 1960s, there's a civil servant who says that there were 26 large saloon cars for traffic duties. There were 41 district mobile patrol cars. But he says there were just 25 armoured vehicles, armoured Humbers and armoured Combers. And these are Second World War vintage things. Even then, they thought they were a bit obsolete, basically. They had a sort of small cannon on the top and looked quite threatening, but actually they didn't think that they were really up to much. He said it's now proposed that the establishment should be reduced to 20, of which 10 will be the new armoured vehicle that they were looking at getting. And he said that the existing vehicles should be that 10 of the existing vehicles should be mothballed for civil defence purposes. That was how they referred to nuclear planning in the Cold War at that period. And 4 of them were to be disposed of completely. There was also only one crime van. That's the vans that they sent to the scenes of major investigations. There was only one water cannon in all of Northern Ireland. And by 1968, a few years later, the number of armoured cars had increased to 33. But that was unintentional. And that was because they realised they couldn't get rid of these things. Nobody wanted them. So they're stuck with them. They ultimately decide that they're going to mothball them for use in a future emergency. And as we know, within months, that emergency comes and is much graver and much deadlier than anybody then, it seems, had foreseen. Coming forward a bit, there is a record from 2003 of a government minister under direct rule who decided that he would change the Stormont Department of Agriculture's custom and practice of issuing press releases to journalists like me in which they named farmers who had broken the law. So if a prosecution was taken by the department of a farmer for having done something that was improper to the extent that it was illegal, they would put out a press release, and if we weren't in court and we didn't cover it, we would get a press release and we would then cover the basics of the case. Joe Bloggs of this address was found guilty on this day by this court of doing this, and he was fined whatever. Very basic, small brief in the paper probably, but it would be out there, it would be on the public record. But that didn't happen with one person for a particular reason. And this was a prominent farmer. He had been convicted of breaking the brucellosis law. He had moved cattle in a way that was against the law. He had not alerted the Stormont Department as he was meant to do. But what the file shows is that this man, Sean Clark, had in January 2003 been convicted of breaking the brucellosis control order in Northern Ireland in 1972. And a ministerial submission to Ian Pearson, who was the then Directorial Minister for Agriculture, said that Clark was convicted at Omagh Magistrates Court. He had pled guilty to a charge of failing to maintain in isolation an animal that had aborted. He was fined £250 at the time, plus court costs. He had accepted that he should have contacted the department, etc., etc. All very straightforward, you might think. However, despite the fact that brucellosis was at this point a major health threat to cattle in Northern Ireland and was a major issue for exporting cattle from Northern Ireland, that press release did not go out in that form. Just a few months earlier, Clark had, in a separate role as a farm leader, a leader of farmers, had been in talks with the department, and he had pushed them quite hard on some of these issues. And he had said they should be doing more. And he was pushing them and saying, you're not doing enough to protect farmers. And what he said that there's a Stormont agriculture official who said that what Clark had presented to them in this meeting was an unrealistically long list of topics he wanted to raise with the minister. However, In 2003, the minister was told about the court case that the department intends to issue a press release about this conviction. This is normal DARD practice following a successful prosecution. We are bringing this particular case to your attention because because of Mr. Clark's role as chairman of the Northern Ireland Agricultural Producers Association. The minister was told that while officials intended to name Clark, no reference to that organisation will be made. However, a few days later, the minister decided otherwise. And a memo says that the minister has seen and read your submission. The minister has agreed to the press release being issued, but does not want any names mentioned. And so ultimately the reference to Mr. Sean Clark of Brockderg Road in Omagh was replaced by the words, a County Tyrone farmer. Sometimes it is about who you know or your position. Two final things. In 2003, the government decided that Belfast City Airport was dangerously open to terrorist attack by dissident Republicans, but basically by anybody. And more than that, they wrote to the owners, the Spanish owners of Belfast City Airport, threatening them that if they didn't move immediately to provide armed police at the airport, that they would be compelled to do it by legislation and they would be billed for it. And they would have to pay the policing board for those officers. This came in a letter from Jane Kennedy, who was then the NIO Directorial Security Minister. She wrote a very tough letter to the Spanish owners of the airport. They just bought the airport, and she said that she said in this July 2003 letter that the security imperative at the airport is such that I cannot defer drawing our concerns to your direct attention. The assessment of the government, but more importantly of the Chief Constable for Northern Ireland, who we saw in that film, is that current security arrangements at the airport are inadequate. Now, this is 2 years after 9/11. There's a particular set of circumstances here. There have also been multiple, I think it was 27 Irish dissident Republican attacks over the previous year, many of them foiled, but it was a much more dangerous point than it might be seen to be today. And what she says to the owners in Madrid is that the Chief Constable was clear on the need for an armed police presence, primarily in response to the continuing threat from dissident Republicans. She said there can be no doubt that the airport is an important economic infrastructure vulnerable to terrorist attack. And in the absence of agreement, the government is now left with no alternative but to initiate unilateral action to protect the wider public interest. And she said she had laid before Parliament an order made under the Airport Security Act 1982 to designate Belfast City Airport, and that would mean they would have to pay for it. So this had the desired effect. And we don't actually see that in the file. Sometimes we get this where a file cuts off, and maybe next year we'll see the next file as to what actually happened inside government. But what we know from Hansard, from the parliamentary record, is that there was a written parliamentary question that was tabled some months after this, asking about what was happening at Belfast City Airport in terms of its arrangements for security, and it shows that they had complied. But quite interestingly, when I asked the policing board several weeks ago after reading this file if they were paying for the armed presence that is there, they're not. So at this point, they were being threatened that they were going to have to pay for it. It's a very successful airport commercially. They're not paying for it now. The final thing I want to talk about is also from the early 2000s, and it's about Ian Paisley Jr. And this is a very interesting file because it's something that I'd written about as a journalist. And when I saw the words Giant's Causeway, I thought I really have to look at this. Some of you will remember Ian Paisley Jr.'s infamous statement that he knew of the North Coast developer Seymour Sweeney. He'd been lobbying for Seymour Sweeney while he was a public representative. There's nothing unusual about that. There's nothing improper about that. People come to MLAs all the time, and they, if they think it's a worthy idea, they will advocate on their behalf. But what Ian Paisley Jr. hadn't been public about at that point was just how close he was to Seymour Sweeney. Seymour Sweeney was a member of the DUP. It's not entirely clear when he joined, but he certainly was by the point that Paisley was a junior minister in 2007 and 2008. And ultimately, this was the thing that led to not just Ian Paisley Jr.'s downfall as a junior minister, the only Stormont minister, to the best of my knowledge, since the Good Friday Agreement, to have been forced to resign. But it was a critical moment in destabilising his father as First Minister of Northern Ireland. There were people within the DUP who were quite happy to help some of those in journalism, and I was one of them in a very junior capacity who were digging into some of this. And so this was more significant than it first appeared. It wasn't simply about claims about a property developer and improper lobbying and being open and transparent. There was much more politics that lay behind this. But what we see in these files is that this had been going on for much longer, perhaps, than some people thought, even in 2007 and 2008. At the point where this came out publicly in terms of questions around Ian Paisley Jr.'s links to Seymour Sweeney, he was very bullish about it. He said that people were being small-minded. He said they were being mischievous. And he really said, basically, that there was nothing to see here. There was nothing remotely improper. Everything was above board, and everything was fully transparent in the way that it should be. And what we see in these files is new detail about how long this had been going on for and precisely how it operated. So there is reference in one of these files. There are several files in Giant's Causeway. There's reference in one of these files to a May 2020 meeting between Jerry Loughran, who was Permanent Secretary of DETI, the Stormont Department charged with tourism, where he met Ian Paisley Sr., Ian Paisley Jr., and Gardner Kane, who was a DUP councillor from Moyle District Council, to discuss the position on the Giant's Causeway. Paisley Sr. told him that a new visitor centre should be larger, should be more applicable to the modern tourism needs, not just a replacement for what had been there. It had burnt down the previous centre, and he described it as a golden opportunity. August 2001, Paisley Jr. wrote to the DETI minister, Sir Reg Empey, the Ulster-Unionist at that point, to request a meeting with Seymour Sweeney to discuss his plan for an arts and crafts centre at Ardyhannon. Now, for those of you familiar with the Giant's Causeway, that's on land just opposite the terminal of the Bushmills Model Railway, which is just a few fields away, basically, from where the Giant's Causeway is. The North Antrim MLA said, "I trust you will look favourably at my constituents' request for advice and guidance. I trust that you would be agreeable in the first instance to a meeting with myself and Mr. Sweeney." Paisley said the development would be a major money spinner for the Moyle area. And in a letter to Paisley, which he passed on to the department, Sweeney told him that given the sizable financial implications, he wanted assistance in knowing if Stormont would give him a grant towards his plan. So basically, Sweeney wants taxpayers' money, and Paisley is lining up behind this and asking and pressing for Stormont to meet with him and to take this seriously. Reg Empey bats this over to the tourist board. He doesn't really want to get involved, basically. They meet with Seymour Sweeney, the North Coast developer, and 2 months later, nothing has satisfied Paisley or Sweeney, so they come back for more. Paisley writes to Empey. He asks for a ministerial meeting at this point, and he says, "I hope you'll be agreeable to meet with my constituent who proposes to bring employment into this area of North Antrim." Empey's officials advise him to again decline to the meeting. They say, "Don't get involved in this." And so he writes to Paisley to tell him that retaining the Causeway's World Heritage status was absolutely crucial, and that any development near the site had to be both world-class and environmentally sensitive. The tourist board then formally objected to Sweeney's proposal for a visitor centre at the site, saying that it had the potential to forever compromise the visual and environmental integrity of the area. They said it would further urbanise this iconic world tourism site, and it feared that this development would signal to prospective developers that the Causeway location is open for commercial and residential development. By this stage, the proposed development was already intensely controversial, and it was making national headlines. The Independent on Sunday ran a report in August 2001 under the headline, "Outrage over Theme Park Scheme for Giant's Causeway." Now, that was the characterisation of it given to it by the National Trust. I'm sure that Seymour Sweeney would say that he had no intention of building a theme park there. But what Sweeney had separately been granted planning permission for was what is now the Nook pub close to the Giant's Causeway Visitor Centre. And in August 2001, the Tourist Board's interim chief executive, David Macaulay, told Reg Empey that fellow Ulster-Unionist minister Sam Foster, and what you see here is a bit of tension between these two Ulster-Unionist ministers, where Foster is much more willing to approve this, and Empey is much more sceptical about this and worried about this. Some of that might be explained by their different briefs. One's the planning minister, one is the tourism minister, so there's a natural tension, sometimes even within parties. But for whatever reason, Empey and Foster are not on the same page about this. And so what MP says to Foster is that his approval of planning permission for the Nook will be met with much disappointment by those concerned to ensure the integrity of the World Heritage Site and its setting is not undermined. He MP then told the National Trust that he had told Foster he was personally very concerned at planning permission for the Nook, because even if Sweeney, as the initial developer, was environmentally sympathetic, there was nothing to stop him selling the building on to someone else after he had developed it. Paul Nolan in the National Trust then tells MP that UNESCO, which manages World Heritage sites, which has the power to revoke that status, is considering classifying the site as under danger, something he said was a term usually used for areas in third world countries. In November 2001, the Tourist Board Chief Executive Alan Clark said that Ruth Laird of the National Trust had told him that the Council's handling of a bidding process in which the National Trust was up against Seymour Sweeney's company had been a mess. Clark said that Laird told him that the National Trust had been asked to upwardly increase their bid. She felt that both the competitive bidder and a local MLA had been privy to the Trust's initial bid. She also claimed to have received threatening phone calls regarding the Trust's interest in the site. And interestingly, she also says to him that the National Trust in England were extremely nervous about the situation, not only because of the size of their bid, which she said had gone into multi-millions for this site, but she said that there was a lack of local responsiveness. So effectively, they were looking in from England and saying, we're pumping this enormous sum of money into the Giant's Causeway, and you people don't really seem terribly interested in this. So there's this acute alarm. That's where the file ends. Maybe we'll get more next year. But interestingly, now out of politics, Ian Paisley Jr. popped up in the news yesterday. He's going to Donald Trump's inauguration as a guest of the Trump family. It'd be fascinating to see the files of whatever transpires there, but I don't think that's something that we're likely to see. So thank you very much.
Firstly, I have to agree with Sam as regards although I think he kind of, having told us it was all very boring, it wasn't as boring as he made it as we thought, but I think at first glance, yes, just certainly the modern stuff didn't have the intricacy of the last 2 years. We've been looking at things like the lead up to the Good Friday Agreement. We've been looking at the handover of devolution. There wasn't quite as much as that of that this year, and I think when I tell you that the most interesting files I found were the first minutes of the Northern Ireland Executive. I think you'll get a sense of just how interesting it is. If that passes for interesting, it says a lot about how sad my life is. But I do actually, the more I read, I went, oh my lord, I spent my week looking at Northern Ireland Executive Minutes, just what you want coming up to Christmas. But the more I got into them, the more, I think, the more you drilled down into the documents, the more interesting little nuggets came up. And even just this one here, the minutes of the first meeting of the Northern Ireland Executive, a very unprepossessing document in its own right. But the substance isn't very significant, but the actual document itself is significant in that it's a historic document because this records the first meeting of the Power Sharing Executive. 25 years ago last December, so I was sitting there in the PRONI reading room, and I must say thanks to all the great staff in PRONI, and particularly the very efficient people in the reading room who bring out all the files for us, and to Jane and to Claire Allen and Grace Gordon and all the staff in PRONI who do all that great work behind the scenes that Jane set out. But I was sitting up there going, oh, it's the 25th birthday of the Northern Ireland Executive, let's have a party. And Jane was talking about 25 years of FOI. When I was walking down here, I saw some workmen putting a 25-year sign on the Odyssey, and I was tempted to go over and tap them on the shoulder and say, you should bring that up to Stormont. But then I thought, well, I suppose actually it might be 25 years in theory, but it's really only about 16 years in practice. So we've a bit to go yet. But I was fascinated. I just thought that the chairman welcomed members to the first meeting of the Executive Committee. It's a very simple line, but that line includes so much, that we got to having a power sharing executive after all of the efforts in 1974, after all of the hoo-ha of the Good Friday Agreement and all that excitement. That one line sums up so much. And then I had a look at the list. They tell you who are there, and they don't tell you the people. They give you the offices, and you're kind of going, who's the minister for this, that, and the other at the time? And you have here. So I dug out the photo to go with the set of minutes there, and I have to say I was still living in the south of Ireland at the time, so I wouldn't have been as au fait with the internal doings of Northern Ireland politics. So I did have to look up Wikipedia to see who held all these jobs. So we had David Trimble and Seamus Mallon. We had Breed Rogers, Michael McGimsey, Martin McGuinness, and then thank you, Sam, because you mentioned some names here, so this makes my job easier. The two unionist ministers there you were talking about, Reg Empey and Sam Foster, Mark Durkin, Sean Farron, and Barbara de Bruin, I think. So that's my, did I get them all right? But of course the eagle-eyed among you will go, that doesn't look right. That's not a full list. And no, it's not a full list, because we are missing the ministers for regional and social development. Not only would the DUP ministers not write to Martin McGuinness, they wouldn't sit in the same room as him. So if you remember when devolution happened 25 years ago, the DUP, in spite of its opposition to the GFA, agreed to take their ministerial seats under de Hond, but they wouldn't sit in the same room as the ministers. So it was agreed at at the first meeting of that executive that the two ministers who were not present would receive papers for minutes of the executive committee. So even though they didn't attend, they were given all the relevant papers. But that didn't last for very long, because in the spring of 2000, the DUP ministers threatened to disrupt further the workings of the executive by rotating their ministers. So Peter Robinson might be minister for something one week, and Nigel Dodds will be minister for the next week, and then somebody else will be minister for the week after that. And this, of course, was simply unworkable. I mean, I know we have rotating Taoiseach and things like that now, but rotating ministers along the DUP line wasn't going to run, and it was designed to. It was an obstruction tactic. And we see here in the minutes how the executive responded to that, and we see that this right was, first of all, was withdrawn. So we see there that the ministers would no longer have access to those documents as of right, and if this continued, if these threats continued, then that the executive would consider other action that may be appropriate. Now, I think things lingered on, of course, by within about 2 years. Things changed quite a bit, because there wasn't anything to be a minister for. Again, I looked at some of the more interesting dates of how the executive responded to some of the events, and we have here the meeting of the executive in September 2001, at which Reg Empey at that time, of course, was, you'll wonder why was Reg Empey joint chairman. It was one of those musical chairs where David Trimble had for a brief period stepped down as First Minister, and Reg Empey had stood in his place. And here it's just noticed that in response to, it's just 2 days after 9/11, in response to 9/11, Reg Empey and Seamus Mallon had written to President Bush on behalf of the executive, expressing their sympathy. Most of the executive meetings, there's a lot of other things, there's some talk about Holy Cross and things like that in that particular set of minutes, because of course prior to the 11th of September the big issue here was Holy Cross, and then after the 11th of September it was off the agenda. To go back to another one, of course minutes will only give you a little hint, and you're kind of, I'd love to know what was really going on there. And this is a very good example of it here. We have one here this is from March 2002, I think. I should have put the date in there. I think it's March 2002, where Martin McGuinness, this comes at the end of the minutes, and the Minister for Education raised concerns that the Ulster, that the First Minister, David Trimble at the time, had breached the ministerial code. Now, accusing a minister, and particularly a First Minister, of breaching the ministerial code is a fairly serious allegation to make. And it says during his speech at the recent Ulster Unionist Party annual general meeting. Now, of course, the minutes don't tell you what it was that David Trimble said, which led Martin McGuinness to make this accusation, but it was that speech Trimble gave. I think even his more sympathetic admirers will say it probably wasn't one of Trimble's better judged moments, where he referred to the south of Ireland as a pathetic sectarian and monocultural state. So you can see why Martin McGuinness might have jumped on that. Again, it's the ministers. It was agreed that the ministerial code should be the subject of discussion at a further executive meeting. Now, of course, there weren't very many more executive meetings because it all went belly up in October of later that year. But again, you'd love to be in the room to know what happened. I mean, that is so tantalising. You just love to have been a fly on the wall and find out who really said what and how heated did it get. But alas and alack, government minutes are never going to tell you that. Something that did come up that attracted my attention was the file on the planning for the late Queen Elizabeth's Golden Jubilee. Now, at this stage, I think we've had jubilees. We've had platinum jubilees and diamond jubilees. We're kind of used to jubilees. But in 2002, it was the first big one since the Silver Jubilee in 1970. I have to add up now. 7. But for the UK generally, this was an interesting one for the UK generally because it was the first major jubilee since devolution was introduced UK-wide, not just Northern Ireland-wide. So a lot of the lead was taken in England and Wales by the Department for Education and Employment. And because it was the education, I suppose the Westminster Central Education Department that was taking the lead, then the sense was that the devolved similar departments, so the Welsh Education Department and the Scottish one and the Department for Education in Northern Ireland would be the ones who would follow suit. Now, of course, that this planning started around 2001 and it's kind of, oh, what are we going to do? One person suggested to the Department of Education that they might feel, given our rather unique circumstances in Northern Ireland. I do love civil servants understatement. Maybe we should leave the FEE to get on with it. That's the English department. We just part of the thinking behind that, I think, emerged in another letter in explaining what the shall I say the unique circumstances were. Why is this off? This is one in between here. There was a slight problem in Northern Ireland because they knew all this stuff was going on, but nobody was telling them. So they'd get the odd bit of information and they'd be missing jigsaw pieces. And it came down to the fact that the Brits didn't actually understand devolution. They didn't seem to know the difference between the Northern Ireland office and the Northern Ireland executive. So the Northern Ireland office was probably getting all this stuff which was really meant for the Northern Ireland executive. And if it was anything to do with the Northern Ireland office, I'm sure it went into a big black hole where all the Northern Ireland papers go that never come to PRONI. So I think there's a sense here that civil servants in Britain were still learning the ropes of devolution and what it meant and who you were meant to talk to in Northern Ireland. But to go back to our unique circumstances, and again, another wonderful bit of civil service euphemism, there is, of course, some difficulty in the devolved environment with the Department of Education taking the initiative in this area. Now, I wonder what that difficulty might have been. And of course, they don't say it, but it's the fact that the Minister for Education was Martin McGuinness. So they found an easy way out. You know, the Department of Culture, Arts and Leisure might be best placed to do this. Who's their minister again? Michael McGimpsey. Grand. Perfect. We have a solution. And I think that, but that's quite interesting because apart from the fact of who'll do it, there's a jubilee coming up, somebody has to do it, education can't do it because Sinn Féin are running it. Oh, right, the Ulster Unionists. And then it's, right, so we've solved that. What will we actually do? And who'll pay for it? If you ask me, the most important bit in all of this isn't who should look after it. It's this bit here. It's the express wish of Her Majesty that there should be no undue cost. And then the real clincher for what you were going to do in Northern Ireland, which ended up being very little, was that there is no central funding and costs will be borne by the departments within the existing expenditure ceilings. And that part allowed them to use the first part of the sentence, oh, the Queen doesn't want any extra money spent, right, grand, we won't do very much. So basically, whatever they want to do centrally from London, and Her Majesty did come and visit Stormont, and that was under the NIO rather than the NIE. And whatever local groups want to do, grand, let them at it. And let's just say, I think let everybody else get on with it. And if there's no money, we ain't doing much. But I thought it's interesting to give us a moment in time, because it shows us just how far we came between 2002 and 2012 when Mr. McGuinness did meet Her Majesty the Queen. And sometimes you get little nuggets in these documents and you can be getting very depressed about the state of Northern Ireland politics, and you see things like that and go, well, it did actually get better. So I think sometimes there's a bit of a joyful note there. I think, yes, as I said, this all happened not long after, of course, Her Majesty did celebrate her Jubilee. There wouldn't have been an executive in Northern Ireland to be involved in running her Jubilee, because it all came crashing down when John Reid suspended Stormont in October of 2002. And there was lots of planning of what to do about this. And Andrew McCormick, who's still a very senior commentator on all things devolution and Brexit related, and I'm sure Sam it gets a fairly big index entry in Sam's book on RHI. But it was his job to try and work out what the relationship between devolution, the suspension of devolution and the return of direct rule ministers and the UK Treasury would be. And the first thing that comes across is nobody expected this to go on as long as it did. Overall, it is clear that people want to make the new arrangements work and have done much to achieve that in spite of the difficulties caused by the absence of corporate memory. That actually interested me. This is 2002. It's only 3 years after devolution. They've already forgotten how to run the place under direct rule. Maybe it was willful. It's right, we're out of here, we're gone. We don't want anything more to do with this. And then 3 years, could you come back? No, sorry, we've forgotten how to do that job. But I think it does tell you something about the transitory nature of the civil service, and once that memory, that corporate memory is lost, it's very hard to get it back. But here we have Andrew McCormick from 2003 talking about how obviously the hope and expectation is that these principles and ground rules will only apply for a short time. Yes. Some civil servant somewhere in 2002 photocopied this big batch of things saying, and you find them in all the files saying devolution suspended. And fair play to them, because wherever they put that batch of documents, they've made great use out of it ever since. But you get this, you come to a file, and unfortunately I didn't take the 2 images, but literally I found one file and there's a pink sheet saying devolution suspended October 2002. You turn it off, turn it over, there's no papers in between, and it's devolution restored 2007. So I think poor old Andrew McCormick's hope that things would get back to normal faster than he expected didn't pan out. And it'll be interesting to see what papers come out during the period of suspended devolution. It might be a very thin file that the poor civil servants will have to read. I think one of the last things then I want to end on, and it fits in with part of the report from the UTV archive at the start. Just as devolution was suspended in October 2002, the relevant minister had been due to attend a big human rights conference organised by the PSNI, but in the absence of the minister, the civil servants had to go. So I think the civil servants were getting a taste of what would become fairly common practice for them. But I thought the reports of this, the reports around this human rights conference were very interesting. It gave us an insight into the controversial nature of 50-50 recruitment for the PSNI on the community basis. It did also mention that 50-50 recruitment on gender had been suggested, but basically there were so few women in the PSNI are likely to join it that you've ended up with so few police if you had a 50-50 split that there'd probably have been one car for each one of them, going by the 1960s. I thought that much of this, though, a lot of the discussion was about the 50-50, but what it was actually from a side I didn't expect. It was from the racial equality side, not the standard Northern Ireland dichotomy of Catholics and Protestants, but of where you put ethnic minorities, where the other that has become slightly bigger in Northern Ireland in the last 20 years would go. And this was driven by the wider atmosphere around policing in the UK, because it wasn't long after the publication of the Macpherson report into the death of Stephen Lawrence. So the issue of greater representation of the UK's ethnic minority in its policing forces was a big issue in UK policing. So the question was, how does that apply to Northern Ireland? And the problem was that under the 50-50, it had 50% Catholic and 50% Protestant and other. So the ethnic minorities were going to be part of the 50% Protestant and other. So there was questions, well, does that make life difficult for ethnic minorities? Are they likely to have a problem getting in under that? Also, but the converse was mentioned, that in fact, in some ways, maybe this is even more discriminatory to the Protestants who want to join the PSNI, because there is greater competition now in their 50%, because it's Protestants and ethnic minorities. So these ideas were batted back and forth. But I just thought this stood out to me as just a more interesting context of the 50-50 and taking it purely out of that dichotomy of Catholics and Protestants. I think that was most of what stood out with me. My focus, as I say, was my interest was how devolution operated, and I think reading between the lines, you're seeing some very interesting insights into how things went. But I think actually my takeaway was to go back to the one with McGuinness. And when I look at things like the DUP not even sitting in the room, not even writing to other ministers, McGuinness not able to engage with the Queen's Jubilee, maybe I'll leave on the upbeat note that we have an executive again. But maybe things have improved slowly, but we have come a long way, a bit way anyway, in the 20 years since these files, since the time these files deal with. Thanks.